Cool. So let's have a little bit of a chat. The topic for today's session is Beyond Copy Paste Agile, and my name is Cliff Hazel. I am one of the founders of the co-founders of the Flight Levels Academy, and based out of Sweden. I do a couple of interesting things which I will tell you about during the course of today's session. As I said already, I welcome you to ask any questions as we go. It's quite nice to be able to have some interaction during the talk, and it's totally not distracting for me if you're typing in the chat while we're going through the presentation. I will try to have some time for questions at the end as well. So if you prefer to wait till the end, it's also totally fine. But yeah, let's jump straight in. So, title of the talk, Beyond Copy Paste Agile, with the subtext of building the missing links between strategy and operational agility. Hopefully this will make some sense as we move through the content of the talk. So, does anybody know where this is? Anyone perhaps had the privilege to be able to go to this place and visit? Someone is saying CT. For those of you who are not aware, this is actually Cape Town, South Africa. That is one of the World Cup stadiums in the foreground there, the big building that you're seeing. I show this picture because this is my history. It's actually, I have even an African map on my shirt, purely by coincidence today. It wasn't planned at all. But yeah, I'm originally from South Africa. I did not grow up in Cape Town, but I spent a lot of time here. My Agile career and my product management history is all based around work that I did originally in the city. And at some point hanging out here in the lovely weather, as you can see, I received an invitation to come and work in a slightly colder and darker place somewhere else in the world. Does anybody know where this city is, perhaps? Maybe some of you have been.
It's lovely Stockholm.
It is indeed. It is Stockholm, Sweden. So this is a picture of the old town in Stockholm. So the short version of the story is basically I got the opportunity to work at Spotify for a couple of years. And I thought, well, I'll leave the beauty of the previous photo and go and hang out in the also beauty of this photo, but hang out in the cold and darkness in Sweden for a little bit and see what things are about. So over the course of this working history, I noticed quite a lot of companies very interested in the things that Spotify was doing. And I think there were a lot of kind of, a lot of good things that I think people take from it, but I think perhaps also some problems. And so that's kind of a little bit where this talk is framed from. My journey at Spotify, pretty wild. When I joined, 700 people. 4.5 years later, when I left, we were just over 5,000. In the same time, going from 10 million customers to 200 million customers. It's insane. There's a lot of interesting stories inside this whole space, and I could share some of them in a little bit more detail as we go. Before we jump too much into the detail of the talk, I want to tell you a little bit of a story just to kind of frame a little bit of what I think is important here. So hopefully you all like some food from time to time, but the story goes that a young kid is watching their parents making dinner. And during the course of cooking dinner, the kid notices that the parents take the chicken just before they put it in the oven, and they cut a fairly large chunk of the chicken off the one side before they put it in the pan and into the oven. And for those of you who have kids, you know that the kid's favorite question to ask is, why? Why do you do this? And of course, the parents look at each other and they go, well, actually, we don't know why we do this. We learned this from our parents. We just always kind of assumed it was a good thing. We learned it from our parents. So they go ask the parents, and they get no good answer. They say, well, I don't know. We learned it from our parents. So they go visit the grandparents one weekend. The grandparents immediately start laughing when they get asked this question of why you cut a little bit off the chicken. Because it turns out, as they say, my dears, when we got married, we didn't have so much money. We had quite a small oven, and therefore our pan was quite small. The only way to fit the chicken in the oven was to cut a piece off the side. Now, the reason I tell you the story is I think because it's a little bit funny, but also because I think it illustrates a lot of what I see happening, is that we do this in our companies, in our personal lives, in our organizations. We copy and paste things from other organizations and from other people without necessarily understanding the reasons why they made those choices, right? So the issue here is not necessarily that you copied something. I mean, this kid and these parents have learned how to cook a roast chicken, but they have also copied this practice of cutting a piece off the back, and that is perhaps not so helpful. I think often also what happens inside organizations is we have this situation where during the recruitment or the onboarding process, the picture that is painted of the company's capability is this, that the oven is kind of all fancy and shiny, it's very new and modern, everything is quite cutting edge. And the reality is that that is based on our perception of how the company works. However, once you've spent a little bit of time at the company, you might notice that things are a little bit different, right? Also a good quality oven, but the situation is slightly different, right? Instead of being electric, we're now talking about wood. A lot of different potential here, but this means that the organization is quite different. The challenge, however, creeps in when we start to get to a situation where actually the perception of what is there actually doesn't match reality at all. And so sometimes you end up in a situation where the company describes the oven as fancy, but in reality, a little bit behind the scenes, it's more like this. And even on certain days of the week, it's perhaps a little bit more like this, yeah? So the question, of course, is, well, why is perception important? And I think really the way to sum it up is that if you look at these three different methods of cooking, they all have quite different capabilities and possibilities. But if you're buying electricity in order to run your pizza oven, you're going to run into some challenges, right? Or you try cooking a pizza in a microwave. Probably this doesn't help so much, yeah? Maybe you get something, but the reality is that we're not really taking into account the unique capabilities and possibilities of the organization without really understanding what is possible. Yeah. So if we want to move beyond this idea towards this, well, beyond copy-paste agile, I think it's helpful basically to look at the organization and really understand that there are three kind of core areas that we need to explore or develop our capability in. And I'm going to walk you through them kind of one at a time. So the three lenses, before we go into too much detail about each of them, first up, we have systems, how the parts of the organization fit together. What are the things that come together to make value for a customer? Science, which is essentially a shortcut for how do we understand the world? How do we make decisions? How do we test out things and validate whether something works or if we were just lucky? And sapiens, this is about human beings, because usually we have a lot of different human beings with different needs, different interests, different skills, different things that they can bring to the organization. We want to kind of connect all three of these a little bit together in order to make an effective organization. Cool. So let's jump in and talk about the first one. So for me, systems is really about looking at things, looking at an organization through the lens of the interactions between the different flight levels. So I'll explain a little bit about what flight levels is in a second, but maybe some of you have seen something a little bit like this in your organization. You could be a software developer, you could be a manager, a scrum master, whatever your role is in the organization. Usually what you find is you're being pulled from one space to another. A lot of different demands, many, many different types of work on the go. I think the reality is that part of why this occurs is that a lot of what we do in the management space and what we even do as individuals within an organization is essentially looking at our business kind of like this highway, realizing that we are very, very busy, but also noticing that there are some spaces between a few of those cars and saying, I have an idea, we could be more efficient. We could put some more cars on this highway. We could do some more tasks, we could start some new projects, we could hire some more people, we could do all of these amazing change initiatives. In reality, this is always adding more work into our organization. Now, I think this is the reality that a lot of us face.
Love you, happy birthday.
The question, of course, is how do we tackle this? Yeah. So let's look at an example here. We have.
Hey, love you.
Someone is not muted. Let's see if we can quickly. Those of you who are not, don't have your video on and so on, would you mind just muting yourselves if possible? It'll make it a little bit easier. Some background noise. Cool. So we have something usually in the organization like this, right? Something a little bit like a team board. We visualize some work that happens. Something is happening along these lines, right? Now, the question that we can ask, what happens when the work gets done? Is this actually done? Like, is it valuable for the customer at this point? Now, for a typical team, this is usually not the case. Maybe in this case, we talk about a software development team. The reality is that somewhere between develop and done, there's actually quite a few other things that are happening in order to create value. Maybe we do something like this, a little bit of integration work. Perhaps there's also something like some acceptance work, even something like actually releasing the work. Yeah. I think it's important that we actually start to see a little bit of these things, because often if we just drop something and done, the challenge is that we don't necessarily realize that there is work beyond the work that is needing to be done. It doesn't help if we've deployed it into our staging environment or even into our production environment if we haven't actually yet released it to the customer. Of course, the other part of this is that very often we're doing these things only on a monthly or quarterly basis, right? So this perhaps slows things down a little bit, it causes some delays, that kind of an issue. But at least once we're done with these things, once it survives the release process, we end up over here and we're sitting actually with done. However, we could also look at it from the other perspective and say, well, what happens before the work arrives? Where does this work actually come from? And reality is that we're usually only looking at it through the lens of a development backlog. We have just the team, if we're HR and we're doing hiring, this might be a hiring backlog or whatever it is. But the point is, it's just the backlog for a single team. The reality is that the way that this work arrives in the organization is that it often does some other things beforehand, right? So we have a development backlog, but before that, maybe we have something like a product backlog and some analysis work that we do. If we keep going a little bit left, so what happens before that? Maybe we even end up with something like this: pool of ideas, some triage, maybe a steering committee, some approval process, some concepts are done, maybe that sort of a thing. Really what we start to notice is that there's actually quite a lot of things in our flow, many, many steps in the organization. And of course, like we said before, we're doing these things monthly, quarterly, and yearly. Not all of these are happening on a super agile basis, right? So once a year, we do a budgeting process and we approve all of the new projects and concepts. Once a quarter, the steering committee is meeting. But of course, when we talk about being agile, we're talking about this step over here, right? We're trying to make this go as fast as possible. So at some point in the time, we've done all of our agile transformations, we've made all of the teams agile, and super cool. We are very, very, very fucking agile over there. But what is the point, I ask you? Why do we want to try to be agile in one tiny step of the process? It's a little bit like trying to drive in rush hour traffic in a Ferrari between traffic lights, right? You can go super fast when the light is green, but 90% of the time you're sitting stuck behind other cars. This is not super, super helpful. The reality for us is that these are the working steps, only tiny little bit amount of working. But for almost all situations where you look from the point of view of the customer value flows or the value streams, what you see is the very, very small amounts of time where there is actually work being done that adds value. Most of the time, the work is waiting around. However, as you can see from this picture, once you start to visualize the end-to-end value stream, you can start to see where is the difference between the working and the waiting times. And you can start to see a little bit more of the picture, right? We're going a little bit beyond the team level, starting to see how ideas go from concept to cash, or all the way from idea to some kind of value. So, if you want to think about this, how to address this issue, for me, the key here is that you have to visualize the end-to-end value streams or the value flows, all the way from vision to value or from concept to cash. It doesn't make sense to focus only on the team level. We need to view the full end-to-end flow, yeah? Of course, there is another angle to this, right? The reality, for most of us, if we think of our company as this keyboard, usually what we've done is something a little bit like this. Right? We've organized our teams around a different row of letters. Maybe one team is doing marketing, one team is doing sales, one team is doing software development. In this case, our company is in the business of writing letters, and the customer comes to us with the wish, I would like you to write me a love letter, right? Now, what we have to do is try to coordinate between all of these different teams in order to produce this letter. And the thing is that this challenge gets even a little bit harder as the company grows. What we tend to find is as we specialize and we get more kind of capabilities in the teams, we actually split it up even further, and each team becomes a single letter in the organization. And just like what I talked about before, what we're doing in an agile organization is trying to make the team that pushes the A key, push that key as fast as possible, as if somehow that's going to make the letter come out quicker, right? Now, it might be your situation that having more A keys is somehow good, but my experience is that if you start a letter with A and you write A's for 6 weeks, probably it's not a very good love letter, yeah? What we need to try to do is actually do some coordination between the teams. We need to have the right team pushing the right key at the right time, yeah? Or to put it another way, we need the right team doing the right thing at the right time. The key for me here is that really what this is about is trying to create the feedback loops between the teams. we need to have some coordination and communication so we know what is the right thing. Should I work on this project or that project? Should I work on this story or that story? Should I help out with this initiative or that initiative? Which OKR is actually the most important thing to focus on right now? Something like this, yeah? So I promised you I would explain a little bit about flight levels. I'll show you this picture. In a flight levels world, we think of the organization in 3 levels, right? We start at the bottom with operational. This is where the making happens. It could be something like software development. It could be hiring teams. It could be writing financial reports. It could be selling products, whatever it is that is the actual operational and delivery work. Yeah. If we look up at the top, usually the organization at level 3 has something like a strategy. You know, we want to enter these markets. We want to be the best at this thing, something like this that we want to do. For me, the key here, and what I show you in the previous slides, is really about visualizing at level 2. What we're doing is we're focusing on the end-to-end coordination and trying to say, instead of each team doing their own thing and working on different letters or trying to push their letter as fast as possible, let's say this project over here is the most important. How do we get all of the teams to push the right letters for the right, to produce that project so we can deliver some value to a customer? There is, of course, another aspect to this, right? What we're trying to do at some level, if you think about it, maybe you've seen a picture like this. What we're trying to do is provide a more coherent or complete picture of the organization as a whole. It's not about any one of these perspectives. It's actually about all of them together, right? The green side is not seeing the truth, the red side is not seeing the truth, and the blue side is not seeing the truth. But together, they see a portion of the truth. And if we combine it into one view, we get to see a little bit more of what is actually the reality. So to put this another way, coordination, operations, and strategy are all valid and legitimate views within an organization. It doesn't make sense that we optimize only for one or only for the other. We actually need to work on all of them at some level at the same time. And usually what we do in our organizations is we focus only at the team level. We try to make the team as fast as possible, but we don't think so much about how it connects through coordination and up to strategy. Yeah. So if we want to try to address this, I think what's really important is that we start to go beyond the team level. We need to be able to connect through the multiple different flight levels and actually paint a picture that connects the strategy and the operations together. It's not enough just to see one level or another. We need to have all of them somehow connected. Yeah. Sorry, I just mute my notifications. My watch is going crazy. It is now off. So to recap, 2 things that I wanted you to take away from this part so far. And then we're going to talk about the other 2 topics. Visualize your end-to-end flows. Don't focus just on the development piece in the flow, right? You have to be able to see the end-to-end flow. And the second is that we need to do a vertical connection, right? Connecting the strategy to the operations through the coordination layer. We need to be able to understand which of the projects is most important, which of the initiatives, which of the change initiatives, which of the activities are actually connecting. So if you're interested to learn a little bit more about this particular piece of the topic, specifically about systems, 2 books that I can recommend that are really quite fascinating in this space. First one, Thinking in Systems by Donella Meadows. This book is really a great primer on understanding the fundamentals and key concepts behind systems thinking, what makes it work, and all of the aspects around it. She gives many great examples from different organizations, from different types of systems, from forestry to oceans to political systems. Highly, highly recommend checking this book out. And the second one, of course, is Klaus Leopold's book, Rethinking Agile, which tells the story of a company going through transformation and facing these challenges, and expands in a little bit more detail on the concepts that I talked about here. So how do we address these challenges of connecting the organization back together and building something that is not just about the team focus, but actually about the customer? Cool. So that brings us to the end of the piece on systems. Let's talk for a minute about science. So for me, science is really, the point of this topic is about the observation and experimentation, right? So trying stuff and learning. You've heard of things like the PDCA cycle, Plan, Do, Check, Act, something like Inspect and Adapt. Maybe you've heard of the OODA loop, Observe, Orient, Decide, Act, something like this. These are all, for me, kind of variations of the same sort of a thing. The key thing here is that there are really 2 main factors. There is an observation to understand the reality of what's happening. And the other is some corresponding experiment. We say, given the observation we've made, we try this thing and we think it will make some effect. So then we look at the effects, again, back to observation. What happened? Now we try something new, right? This is how kids learn to learn or learn to walk, how to talk, all of this kind of thing. We all do it somehow naturally, right? We take on some information and we do it. We learn as we go. So let's look at an example. I showed you a board before, very similar to the previous board. What we're talking about here is what actually happens when something ends up in done, right? Very often what happens is that we're focused on, I think, more an output. We delivered a thing, but we didn't necessarily check if it achieved an outcome that we wanted. I saw a crazy statistic from Adobe. It said that 87% of features that they built inside the company were never used by a customer. 87%. Like, this is a ludicrous number, right? Now, the point is not to say that it was a bad idea to build those features in the first place, although you could argue that perhaps there is some space to be able to explore this topic. The point is that what you want to at least do is not spend time maintaining and continuing to support these features beyond the point where they are actually useful. Yeah. So what we want to first do is not just measure the output. The output is necessary. We have to deliver something before it can achieve an outcome. But let's continue to look at it until we find an outcome, or we realize maybe there's no outcome and we should move on to something else. For those of you who ever watched the show South Park, for me, what we often do is a little bit like the underpants gnomes. We have this great plan. At step one, we're going to collect all the underpants. And then somehow in phase 3, we're going to make profit. But phase 2 has really nothing. It's just missing something. We don't understand how to connect it, right? We hope and we dream and we have some sort of a vision, but we don't actually check that the thing that we do is working, right? Part of the reason why this happens, as Jonathan Haidt explains in this book, The Righteous Mind, is that the human mind is a story processor more than a logic processor. And so we think the way that we think that we work is that we look at the data and we think our way through it through some rational or logical conclusion and then come to a decision at the end. Where the reality is actually that what we do is we usually use our intuitions to make the decision, and we use our rational ability to construct a story that explains why we made the decision, right? Now, it's important to know this because what we're trying to do here is overcome the tendency to just do things based on intuition and not have enough information available to learn, right? Another aspect of this is if you look at it through the lens of this fantastic book, Thinking in Bets by Annie Duke. She talks about this concept of what she calls resulting, right? As she says here, what makes a decision great is not that it has a great outcome. It's about the data and the information that you use to make that decision, right? If you think about it in poker, which is Annie Duke's profession, she plays in the World Series of Poker, very successful poker player. If you win a lucky hand, but you thought that the reason that you won that hand is because you're super smart, pretty soon you're going to start to trust your own instincts, think you're a genius. Not too long before that or too long after that, you're going to be making some pretty stupid bets. However, if you actually are able to separate the difference between the influence of the information you use to make the decision and the luck, the role of luck in this situation, you can start to understand, am I winning my hands at the rate at which I'm betting? So if there's a 50-50% chance, but I win those hands 90% of the time, maybe there's something else behind this, right? So we want to try to avoid the situation of assessing the outcome of something, whether it's good or bad, as being the thing that influences whether or not it was a good decision. You can make a good decision and have a bad outcome. That can still be a good thing. So how do we do this? How do we overcome these challenges? For me, the first and most simple step here is to get in the habit of writing down our hypotheses, or write your hypothesis down and use that to reflect. Quite simply, this overcomes this challenge of the sort of constructing a story after the fact, right? If we do this thing, I think these things will happen. And then at some point, once we've delivered the thing, we can look at what actually happened. Now we also have a record of the data we used to make the decision, and we can start to compare between the two. Do I need to update my mental model, my thinking, my understanding of the customer segments, the market, customer needs, something like this? Or did we just make a mistake and we built something that could be iterated on and improved? What do we need to do here, right? Helps us to learn. Some simple ways that you can phrase this is to say, if we had this today, what would the benefit be, right? we had this functionality, if we made that button on the website green, if we launched in those markets, whatever it is that you're doing, what would the benefit be? And try to quantify it in terms of an increase in signups, some sort of money that you would make, how many customers it would bring in, something along these lines, right? Another way to think about this is to say, well, what assumptions would need to be true for this to work, right? So we would need to have this, this, and this happen in order for that to work. So quantify your hypothesis before you start, right? And reflect as you go. So the second piece of this is to avoid this challenge, as we talked about earlier, right? We have a highway that's super busy, our company is massively overloaded, but we're sitting in a situation of saying, but there is still space, right? I know this is a hard one to overcome because you have 5 minutes spare. Nobody likes to sit around doing, or most of us don't like to sit around doing nothing for very long periods of time. So we start something new. I'll show you an example. This is a flight level 2 system used inside Spotify. So a coordination across, in this case, a tribe of about 85 people at the point this photo was taken. And on the right-hand side, the top right-hand side, what you can see here are some things labeled current bets, right? Now, what this is doing is it has taken the set of high-level priorities for the organization, ranked them in order, so said this one is number 1, this one is number 2, this one is number 3, and so on down. And we have copied them from the strategy down to the coordination level, and we can see what they are. What this enables us to do is to use a simple heuristic that I describe as don't let number 3 block number 1, right? This was something that we used quite often, or we're trying to use as much as possible. The idea is quite simple. If I'm working on number 1 and you're working on number 3, I should be able to ask you for help, and you should switch what you're doing, work on number 1. Similarly, if you're working on number 3 and you need my help, you should understand that if you ask me for help, I'm quite likely going to say, sorry, I'm busy with number 1. Or perhaps you could take it a step further and say, well, I won't even ask in the first place because I already know what you're working on. And so I won't bother you because it's much better if you stay focused. The key thing for me here is not so much, of course, the question always comes up, which one do you pick as number 1? I think this is a whole interesting topic and not really in scope for this discussion. I think what is most important here is not so much which one you pick, but it is that you pick a number 1, right? If you're in an organization that currently works on 17 or 18 things at a time, if you picked any one of those, focused on it, and got it done, you would make your situation better, right? If one of those things got a free, like think of it like fast track at the airport or like a VIP queue at a nightclub, something like this, right? You just get to jump the queue and go straight ahead. Once you give something this free pass, suddenly things happen. To illustrate the point, most of us have seen this happen quite recently with COVID-19. Every organization in the world had been trying to do some sort of digital transformation or digital strategy, maybe even allowing things like remote working. Suddenly COVID happens. In the space of 6 to 12 weeks, everybody has something like Zoom or Teams. People have got laptops. We've figured out all the VPN and security issues. Well, 90% of them at least. The reason that this worked is not because there was somehow some new information or whatever that was available about those kind of initiatives. It was quite simply, it got the focus, yeah? Got the focus and the attention, and it moved fast. And so what's fascinating for me is that you've seen very old corporate, slow-moving companies that typically would say, we can't move fast. They just did it. They moved fast, and they were able to do it. And the reason they did it is because they used this concept of don't let number 3 block number 1. And this will help you, as the subtext says here, to avoid making traffic jams or to avoid making the traffic jams worse. So, to summarize this point about the science part, if you want to dig a little bit further, 2 books that I can recommend for you. First is Escaping the Build Trap by Melissa Perry. Talks about product management and product strategy and good frameworks for making clear decisions within an organization. And the second one, as I already mentioned earlier, Thinking in Bets by Annie Duke, really helpful for getting that concept of thinking kind of as placing a bet with some sort of risk and uncertainty, how to adapt and make better decisions. Making decisions or making smarter decisions when you don't have all the facts is the subtext of the book. Cool. So to recap this section on the science, the 2 points here, quantify your hypothesis, write it down before you start, reflect and learn as you go. And secondly, don't let number 3 block number 1. This will help you avoid your traffic jams. Cool. Let's talk about the third and final topic. And I think in many ways, this is perhaps, I don't know if I say the most interesting topic, but it's the most often overlooked one, which is sapiens, or the wonderful diversity of humans. Now, I don't know about you, but I often hear the statement of people resist change, right? Something a little bit like this. I guess some of you have probably heard this before, or maybe even the slightly more critical version, which is, and they won't work or won't work on those things unless we tell them or tell them what to do, right? Now, the challenge for me with this is that it basically makes the assumption that people are either lazy or incapable. Essentially, it implies that we have Deadwood inside our company, right? We have the wrong people. Now, I put it to you that if you have Deadwood inside your company, there's really only 2 ways that it got there. You either hired Deadwood or you hired Livewood and you killed it, right? Both of these 2 are the responsibility of the company to address. I think part of the challenge with this is that very often what's happening is the way we think about organizations is we think about it through the lens of these kind of things. We think of it as machines, we think of it as interchangeable parts, and we don't really think of human beings as people. I don't mean to sound sort of all hand wavy and hippie about it, but it's people have feelings, they have emotions, they have a life outside of work, they have other things and interests than they do about just your company. And maybe as the owner or shareholder of the company, or even a manager of the company, it's not super surprising to me that people might care about slightly different things to the things that you care about. Now, the reality is that if we treat people through the lens of machines, very often what happens is we tend to focus on trying to maximize or overuse them, and we think that parts are interchangeable. I think that a much better way to think about this kind of stuff is to think about it through the lens of an ecosystem, right? If you imagine you're growing a forest or trying to grow something in your garden, the reality is that you don't give trees quarterly KPIs and targets. You don't shout at them if they go wrong. You don't give them motivational speeches and things like this. We, of course, know that this is not going to work, right? What we do instead is we create the right conditions. We plant seeds at the right time. We create nutrient-filled soil. We make sure there's enough sunlight and enough rain, but not too much sunlight or too much rain. Right? We create the environment that can produce results, right? It's a very, very different way of thinking about this. There is another aspect behind this, and I wonder maybe some of you, can you tell me what is going on in this picture? Does anyone know what's happening here? I won't wait too long, but the short version of this, yeah, Kevin Rush has it. It's a bunch of old white dudes, as Rosanna says, but this is actually Donald Trump's Council on Women's Rights. The guy in the middle with his hand sort of pointing like this is Mike Pence, who at the time was the vice president. Now, I'm not raising this to make a political point. It's just quite simply to say that if you have a room that looks like this, making a decision on women's rights, with quite simply no woman in the room, it's highly, highly unlikely, in fact, I would say impossible, that they make a good decision. The issue, however, here is that very often we have this in our organization. I've worked for many companies in the past, and I've perhaps even been a member of some of these kind of meeting rooms, is that we don't have the diversity, right? We don't have a mix of different roles and responsibilities inside. So we make the decisions really only through a single perspective or a single set of very similar perspectives, right? I think we have to kind of challenge this a little bit. I'm going to come back to this in a second, but before I do that, I want to ask you, does anybody know what's happening here? Maybe some of you have either seen my talk before or you happen to know the story behind this. It was actually, both of these stories were in the news at the time that they happened. So I'll be honest, the first time I saw this picture, I thought it's probably, I don't know, something like a wedding, maybe somebody's graduated, some sort of family ceremony, because these are the mental kind of images of what I associate with this kind of a picture. I look at the people, I see what they're wearing, this kind of a thing. The reality, however, this is the Indian Space Agency having just successfully launched their Mars lander mission. On their first attempt, and for 1/10 of the budget that anyone has done it before or since, right? They spent less money launching a Mars lander than Hollywood spent making the movie The Martian. It's absurd, and it's an amazing achievement, right? The reality, it's the ISRO launching, launch involving several women scientists. The team was, I think, 60 or 75% women, as Jairam is saying. It's a fascinating story. I really recommend looking into this a little bit more. The point I'm making here really is that what we don't usually do is associate Indian women with being scientists, quite simply speaking, right? And that's not to say that there aren't Indian women who are scientists. It's just not the mental model that we have. A lot of us would first assume they are more likely to be women or mothers or something like this than scientists. Now, I want to tell you a little bit of a story about why this happens so that you don't feel just too bad for the biases and so on that we all share. Thousands of years ago, we would have all been wandering around, probably on the plains somewhere around about where my shirt was pictured or visualizing. And at some point, something jumps out of the bush. And if we start to kind of take in some of this information and go, well, it's yellow, it's moving quite fast, it's definitely coming in my direction, looks a little bit hungry. This is too much of a slow decision-making process. By this stage, we've already turned into lunch, right? So what we did was we developed, or what survived from us, is this what Daniel Kahneman calls a fast fit pattern match rather than a best fit pattern match. We don't wait to figure out if it's for certain a lion. We just think it might be, and we run up a tree, round the corner, faster than our friend, whatever it takes to get away from this lion. Yeah. Now, this same capability that saves us from the lion also creates some challenge when we're doing things like hiring, having a discussion on women's rights, or trying to decide if these are mothers or scientists. Yeah. The challenge that we're getting to here is basically that we have a number of these underlying biases. And what I think that we need to start to learn to do is first acknowledge that we have some of them. And I don't mean in a sort of beat yourself up, feel like you're a bad person kind of way. We all have them. We make assessments about things. We can learn to do better. But what I think we should really be doing is learn to intentionally design around our biases, right? I showed you this picture earlier, and I talked about this bringing multiple different perspectives together. A bias is very often just looking at something through a single viewpoint. So we look at it from the red angle here and we see just the square on the wall. But the reality is that there are so many different dimensions. This person is both a mother, a scientist, and a very, very respected PhD student who has done all kinds of astrophysics, right? There are many dimensions to this. We need to learn to see these other dimensions. So how do we do this? Well, if you happen to be in a room that is all one group of people, one type of role, one set of responsibilities, one pay grade, one seniority in the organization, all went to the same school, something like that, perhaps what you could do is you could invite some other people from different backgrounds, whatever dimensions you think could possibly be meaningful within this context, right? Quite simply, in this context, I would start by getting some women in the room, and I would certainly look at women from different income brackets, from different countries, from different cities, different education levels, different working environments. These kind of things will help you to build a better picture and get a better understanding. Essentially, what I'm talking about in a way is, in addition to this, we have to tackle this issue of not just the presence, we have to change how it feels to be in that situation. So if you are the only woman in the previous picture, it might feel a little bit like the kid on the right, right? You're the only person in the room who has some different perspective. It's very hard to talk over a bunch of senior leaders when you're just a person from somewhere else that they've never met. Yeah? So we have to change this dynamic. We cannot make it feel like this when you are doing something like meeting a leader. If it feels like this when you're making a suggestion, we still have some work to do. Yeah? Perhaps even in the context of a retrospective, right? We need to make this dynamic feel a little bit different. Another piece of this is something like a restructure, right? I've seen this so many times. A group of executives make a decision and hand it down to somebody else, and they have just really no context. They don't feel like they can contribute, or really that their feedback will even be taken seriously. Of course, I think we've probably all felt this at some point in our careers or in our lives, but our performance review feels a little bit like this, right? So I showed you this picture a couple of times, and I really emphasized this point of what we're trying to do is bring together multiple different perspectives. And in order to do that, what we have to do is we have to create an environment where people feel that if they have the green perspective and we have the red one, they can bring the green and the blue to the conversation. They need to be able to feel that that is something that is necessary, that is valued, and that there is a purpose to doing this. So if you think about it like this, if diversity is being invited to the party, you just get to attend. What we're talking about here is inclusion. So if diversity is being invited to the party, inclusion is also choosing the music. Yeah. So I want to explore a little bit about this topic of how do we create this environment where people can also choose the music. Many organizations that I've worked in have a very strong bias towards doing verbal communication, especially from senior leadership. Or if we do it written, it's in a giant PowerPoint deck and maybe not shared so widely, right? The challenge with this is that verbal requires people to be present, firstly, for the first time that conversation happens. And usually the format that we follow is I talk about a restructure or a plan I have, I ask for and wait for 2 seconds. Anyone have any questions? No, okay, cool, moving on, right? That did not give anybody really a chance to think about it, to internalize it, to really even understand what it was that I was talking about. So if you want to flip this dynamic, a simple example of what you can do, offer pre-reading. Send out a script of what you plan to say in advance. You will be amazed also how much writing it down helps you to make it more coherent and concise. Secondly, you can give people time to think during this actual process, right? Give them some time to give it a little bit of thought. Just doing a quick little bit of muting. So write it down, as I said, give people some time to think. And secondly, don't forget to follow up. Give them an opportunity to give it some thought and then go into the space of saying, well, what do we do now? What are your takeaways? What are your questions? What did you understand? What did you not understand? This will go a huge way. Another piece that you can try, I'll explain a little bit of the context of this. So basically, this was a simple check-in agenda that we used when meeting leadership teams inside Spotify. And so on a 2-weekly basis, we would sit down, whether it was for an individual squad, a tribe, or for the mission as a whole, and we would have a conversation. We would ask people to talk through what have you achieved and learned since we last met? What are you planning to do next? 3rd, what's on your minds? 4, what are you stressed by? And 5th, as a separate and key difference point, what do you need help with? And the reason for these last 3 being separated out is that we don't want to just talk about, well, very often what would happen is that as a leader in the organization, I would assume that if you are stressed about something, that I should help, right? And so what we noticed was a tendency for the senior leadership to go stick their nose and get involved in topics that people might be stressed about, but they actually had a plan and they had under control. Or they would help in ways that they thought were helpful, but not actually that were being requested. And so what it creates is a space for people to explicitly say, I'm stressed out by this thing. I've got these pieces of it, but I want you to help with this thing over here. Yeah? Cool. There are a lot more examples that I could give you, but the point here is just to really illustrate the example and hopefully let it sink in that there are practical things that we can do to overcome these biases and create a more inclusive and productive environment. If you're interested to learn a little bit more about these 2 topics, 2 books that I can highly recommend. First one, I hope most of you have heard of Esther Derby, and if you haven't, I can highly, highly recommend this book. 7 Rules for Positive Productive Change. It talks about so many different things that are challenges for ways to overcome kind of the organizational challenges that often encounter resistance, or why we encounter resistance, and gives a lot of practical tools for being more effective at leading change. And Multipliers, which is a fantastic book. It's got a lovely set of models and patterns for helping people to recognize how sometimes their strength can actually, in certain contexts, be a weakness, and how to recognize when is an appropriate time to apply it as a strength and when you should maybe defer to others, and how to recognize the difference between these 2. So I want to wrap up a little bit before we jump across to questions. I see there's a few in the chat already, and we'll have a few minutes to answer them in a minute. But very often, before I jump into that, what I hear from people is that a lot of this kind of training and development and learning and so on, coaching and teaching, it's very, very expensive. And kind of what I hear inside this is that it's sort of a thing of, well, what if we train people and teach them stuff? What if we spend all of this energy and then they leave? And I think that it's important that you should think about it a slightly different way, which is, what if you don't and they stay, right? The reality is that we have to be investing in making our organization better. We cannot just be scared that if we pay for people to learn stuff, we invest in buying books, we develop them further, that they will run away, right? So I started out with this question: how do we move beyond copy-paste agile? What are the things that we can do? We've recapped this and said that there are three key lenses, right? We talked about systems, which is the interaction and feedback loops, all the way end to end across all of the flight levels. So not just from the beginning to the end, but also from the strategy all the way to operations. Secondly, we talked about science, right? The shift from outcome or from outputs to outcomes, and taking this approach of quantifying, reflecting, and learning as we go. And thirdly, we talked about sapiens, designing around our intentional biases to be able to leverage the advantages of diverse perspectives. This, for me, is at the essence or the heart of how we build these missing links between strategy and operational agility, and avoid this situation of just doing copy and pasting, borrowing only what other people did without really thinking about how it applies to our organizational context, right? So if you're feeling a little bit tired of the situation of being jerked around and dragged from one team to another, a little bit overloaded, as I showed you in the beginning, I will make my slides available as well. But for those of you interested, we do offer a number of different things through the Flight Levels Academy, different programs you can learn more. A great place to be able to start out is the Introduction to Flight Levels. There's a sign-up code here. There's a link. You get a 20% discount. Check it out if this sounds interesting. We'd love to see more of you in this space and exploring some of these topics and this content. As I say, I will make this available so that you can grab a copy of it. The last thing I can also suggest is Flight Club. So we live stream on YouTube every 2 weeks. It's completely free of charge. Jump on and you can learn all kinds of fascinating things as we interview different folks talking about cool concepts and interesting ideas. You can find us on Meetup if you just go search for Flight Club. Link is also here. All the previous episodes are available on YouTube as well, and the format is fairly straightforward. Panel discussion, you can ask questions, we take questions in the chat, and weave it into the conversation. Cool. Last thing I have to say is to say thank you, and I would love to connect with you on LinkedIn if you have more questions or something you'd like to explore a bit further. Maybe you just want to tell me what you liked, maybe you want to start a bit of a discussion, something that you, I don't know, want to hear a bit more of, something I said that you don't agree with. I'm totally open to any and all conversations. I'd love to say hi and to chat a little bit further with you. So we have about 6 minutes available. And I want to just say, yeah, let's take some questions. I see there's a couple from the chat. Maybe we can just run through a couple of those. I'll just do a quick scan and see what's there. Cool, maybe we just start. I see Maruwan is asking a question, says, did guys at Spotify really work along squads and tribes for a long time? I read that this was only run for a short amount of time. Yes and no. I think the short answer to this is basically that the company was constantly changing and evolving, and some parts of the organization look very much like the videos and the talks that you've seen. Some parts of the organization are very different, and you've got literally everything in between. I don't know if you've ever seen this inside your organization, but really the idea that any kind of one group of people or that a company of a few thousand is somehow exactly the same the whole way around, it quite simply isn't. And that's kind of part of the reason why I emphasize these points about diversity and about different perspectives. There are so many different ways that people operated inside the organization, but I will say that the concept of squads and tribes, and certainly of chapters, was really quite commonly used in the vast majority of the product development space, which was probably about 60–70% of the organization. Hopefully that answers the question. I see is it Julio? Julio is asking, I think I can see your point about connecting strategy and operations. So how to involve the teams on this idea, how to coach them to see the pitfalls and focus on the internal flow besides the whole end-to-end flow, and how to coach so on and so on, instead of thinking this is mapping, take my ownership away. So my assumption is that this question is a little bit about how do you get the team to do this? And I think part of the challenge with this is that often what you see is that people are basically saying, well, this is a team problem to solve. And I think that actually a lot of the strategy work and the leadership needs to be involved in this. There is a necessary to be able to set some kind of a direction and create something, but it's not that the leadership should do this in isolation. I think they should be inviting input. So I don't think that this is something that you actually solve kind of the connect between operations and strategy by going and working inside your teams or squads. This is actually something that needs to come from the middle and the top of the organization, sort of from the outside in, if you will, and actually take that sort of approach. We usually don't involve 2,000 people in making strategic decisions, but we should involve people in figuring out, given that strategy, what are the details of the things that we should now actually build. I hope that that at least slightly answers your question in that space. Just let me know in the chat if that's the case. Let's see here. Eduardo, I see you asking a question about the discount code. I will paste it in the chat in a second. That's the sign up link. If you like the code, it's over there. Cool. So, any more questions that you would like to explore? We have a few more minutes to go. I'm also happy to stick around. I think the one thing that I really like about this format is that it's not a fixed, you can leave at any point if you need to head off to the next section or to the next talk, but it's also totally possible to stick around and have a chat. Cool. Kevin, I see you asking a question. Suddenly finding ourselves in a remote world, which of the 3 S's would you start with improving? I think this is an interesting one. I think this is really, it depends a little bit on your specific organizational context. And part of the thing is that it depends a little bit. So if your challenge is, I don't know, like you can deliver loads and loads of stuff, but you're not really sure what the impact is, then I would say maybe starting with science. However, if your challenge is much more in the like actually getting stuff done space, like you don't deliver nearly enough things, and you feel like it would be sort of a waste, or you would get stuck in a loop of thinking, oh, well, is this the right stuff? And overthinking that space, I might start a little bit more in the system space. I almost always advocate for some work being done in the sapiens space, because I think working with humans, it's all about the humans. You're always having some kind of a situation where the reason things happen the way they are is because people are behaving the way they are. And I say people in a general sense, because I think often what folks do is they interpret that as like the people at the edge of the organization inside the teams and squads. But I think often the management and the leadership responsibilities and those factors are actually playing an enormous role in how things are playing out. So yeah, I think it depends a lot. I'd be happy to sort of chat a bit more if there's something that's like specific to your context. But I definitely think that it's worth kind of using these as lenses to kind of interpret for yourself a little bit, which is kind of why I present it the way I do. Is like you could pick any of these. You probably have to do a little bit of all of them, but maybe you say, well, let's start from this side because we have a different set of challenges. Maybe we don't do everything all in the same go. Cool. Awesome. I will be here for a couple of minutes if anyone else wants to chat, but I think we are probably on time. So I will say thank you so much. It's lovely to have had a chance to talk with all of you. As I say, let's connect on LinkedIn and kind of have a bit more of a conversation and carry on from there. I wish you a lovely rest of AccessAgile. Have a great time and hope to see you around somewhere in the future. Cool. Have fun.
Thanks, please.
It's a pleasure, Alberto.
Yeah, great session.
Awesome. I'm glad you enjoyed it.